Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you're joining us from. My name is Jason Buffington. Leah, you've been joining the show so often. We've been thinking about making you a permanent part of our host roster, and thankfully, that is not an April Fool's joke. So, thank you for joining as a permanent part of our team as we continue to bolster these out. And for all the folks at home, welcome to your worst backup day ever edition. We couldn't get it on April Fools because we like Tuesdays more than Mondays. But Leah, good morning.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from all around the world. I'm super excited to be joining everyone today. And I really just want to encourage everyone to listen into the stories that we're going to be sharing today, but also share your own. One of the great things about this community is that we really have a great way of trauma bonding and really coming together because we have all experienced these sort of catastrophic situations where you might be trying to migrate and something goes wrong. A natural disaster comes in and something goes wrong. Now we're all competing with, ever increasing and smarter cyber attacks and something goes wrong. So it's really important that the community bands together here. So sit back, relax, join us in the chat. Let us know some of your worst backup stories. We are very excited to chat with you guys today and certainly share some that me and Jason have talked about with some of our customers and our community. And then also Jason has experienced himself, because Jason, you certainly have a very prestigious experience in this space. And I think based on what we've talked about, we have some very interesting stories to share today.
Yeah, and speaking of letting us know, let us know where you're coming in from. So we do have our map finally back online within the new programs, and so please let us know now. Leah hails from Ohio. I am from the great state of Texas. We also have production coming out of Arizona. Social media is also out of Texas as well. So Texans are representing today. But please let us know what parts of the world that you're coming from. And yes, we would love to hear your stories along the way. Leah, I know this. Let's talk about the first story that I just thought was amazing, because often when we talk about downtime, it's always in the context of something sterile like lost productivity and lost dollars. And I have a heart for governments when it comes to IT and infrastructure, because there you're talking about service delivery to the constituents, not just downtime dollars. So you brought this one to our party for today. So how bad? What happened, and how bad was it?
Yeah, it was pretty bad what happened. So I am really excited to share the story of one of our great community members, Tamika McKay, who is the CIO at the City of Fort Lauderdale. Now, she's a member of our community now, and she has been at various points throughout her career. But what's really interesting about her story in this case is she had actually just left an organization using Veeam and moved to the City of Fort Lauderdale to become their CIO. And just 6 months in on the job, disaster truly struck. And candidly, this is close to my heart today because I am in Ohio. If anybody's been watching the news, I am in Tornado Alley today. I probably will get a tornado touchdown in the next couple of hours. Of course, it is very sunshiny here, so it's sort of throwing everybody off because it's very warm, but that is the recipe for disaster. So whether you're in a coastal climate or Midlands of the United States, really disaster can strike in any way, shape, or form. Now, last year, I had the privilege of meeting with Tamika in person at VeeamON, and she is going to be at this year's VeeamON as well, hosted in Fort Lauderdale. So she will be a local host for us this time around.
Nice.
Now, when Tamika and I talked a bit about her story, again, she was 6 months on the job. They weren't using Veeam at the time. And frankly, she was working with an IT team that was pretty discombobulated. People weren't necessarily working together. And that's a recipe for not having a good plan. And Jason and I are going to talk a lot about DR planning today because I think he has a lot of experience and passion in this space. If you've tuned into us before, I know you've heard us talk about planning, orchestration, testing, a lot of these day two operations. And certainly, being new on the job as the CIO of the City of Fort Lauderdale, it became very obvious that there wasn't a plan. So what happened was there was a tropical storm that should have been pretty mild by Florida standards. But it came over the city of Fort Lauderdale and decided to take its sweet time passing through. It sat on top of that city for hours and hours, dumping significant rainfall that they simply could not handle. So you can see on the screen here, there was significant flooding that happened in the downtown area, specifically where City Hall was. And Jason mentioned that their mission as a public sector organization is so imperative because they provided central IT services for all of those first responders, all of the government activities. So having any kind of downtime is just catastrophic in a lot of these cases. And this truly was a catastrophe. They ended up having their data center completely flood. And they didn't have a great backup plan in place. They didn't have a great secondary site set up. So Tamika had to rally together this group of IT individuals who, many of whom she'd met for the first time just in the weeks and months prior, and had to somehow rally everybody together to move and salvage what they could out of that location, take it to a secondary site just a mile away where it was sunshine, and do all of that while these people were thinking about their families. Were their homes okay? Were their neighbors okay? So it's really a very, very challenging time to be in that kind of situation. And fortunately, after 2 days, they were able to get all of their systems up and running again. And of course, they had some level of systems up before then. But again, 2 days of downtime for such an important organization is really something that they can't tolerate. So Tamika now shares with our community a lot of stories about how to be better at planning, how to organize your teams effectively, make sure everyone knows what that plan is, make sure everybody knows how important it is that you stay safe, that your friends and family are safe, and that you have a plan to check in with them. So that hopefully you have a lot more confidence when something like this arises in the future. And Jason, I know this is an example of a story that you've heard 1,000 times in different iterations over the course of your career.
1,000 times. First of all, Florida is always rife for crises, right? Because of that constant hurricane challenge. Many years ago, I was the keynote for a DR conference that was in Florida, and my opening line when I got on the stage was, I said, according to the National Oceanic Center, this zip code gets hit every 2.83 years. Not meaning that just in the state of Florida, but this actual zip code has a hurricane pass over every 2.83 years. It has been 3 years since your last hurricane. That was my opening remarks. And everyone's like, oh, right? Because, I mean, it's one thing to say when versus if, and that's cute when it comes to disasters. But statistically speaking, when you know that something's going to happen every less than 3 years, and it's been 3 years, that's a problem statement. The story of Fort Lauderdale happens all over, right? So, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about hurricanes in Florida. In fact, actually, if you one of my favorite clip shots, if you go to the next slide, is the city of Houston, a couple hundred miles away from me, and there is their downtown. And notice that other than the overpasses, it is one big lake. This is after Hurricane Harvey in 2017. A year later, just to the east, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. Very similar, actually far worse along the way. Now, the problem in New Orleans, of course, is that City Hall is actually lower than sea level, so it becomes just a big bowl. When it rains back then. We can go back to the Fort Lauderdale. Those pictures are much more fun. But there's a couple of lessons that we can learn. And Leah, I love some of the things that you drew out from Tamika's story. One of the first things I learned, this is actually in my 20th year as a certified disaster recovery planner. And one of the very first stories I ever heard back when I first took my training was assume your core people are not there. Right now, there's all kinds of reasons why your core people aren't there. Now, in Tamika's case, in Fort Lauderdale's case, they were there. They just were such separate minds because of separate teams and separate workflows. They didn't know how to rally. Right now, positive story. The fact that they got new infrastructure wheeled in 48 hours after the water subsided, that is a massive victory that is beyond the odds. But it is not uncommon, especially in flooding scenarios. If downtown data centers flooded, you know what else probably flooded? My living room, right? And of course, I may report to the CIO, but I also report to the CWO, my chief wife officer. And I promise if my living room is flooded, I'm not coming into work that day. and it
You have
doesn't matter,
priorities.
right? It doesn't matter. I used to have a client that was a financial a bank I can't mention. Anyway, their DR plan included team members that would come to critical other team members' homes to take care of the houses, the kids, the other things. What they were really doing was they were unfettering their key recovery team members, because as long as I know that my wife and my kids and my living room are covered, then I'm willing to boat into the office, so that I can then start to recover infrastructure along the way.
But of
But
course, you had a boat ready for that trip, right? Because you're the DR guy. You had a plan.
well, yeah. It's amazing how much DR planning has changed over the years. I had clients in my early years that key recovery team members, we had these yellow waterproof sacks that you had to keep in your trunk no matter where you were. And it had some cool stuff like a vest that you would wear and a funny hat. It also had a weather grade laptop and a satellite phone. And most importantly, a 3-ring binder of all the policies that you would need in order to get your infrastructure back up and running again. And no matter where you were, if you were within the continent that you are responsible for, you brought that yellow bag with you. It's amazing how those stories have gone. But hurricanes are not the only one we should talk about, right? So if you are in the Northeast, winter power outages due to snowstorms, very common. If you are in the heartland, we are coming into tornado season. Ohio, welcome for that. I've been through some of the tornadoes in Joplin that they still haven't recovered. I mean, there are high schools that are still stacks of rubble and brick. If you're on the West Coast, right? So fires every late summer along the way, along with rolling power outages. A power outage is just as bad if you're down for X number of days. So the stories continue, but when you have those perennial things, it's amazing to me how many people are so surprised when a disaster actually hits.
Yep.
So anyway, hey, I think we do have some map updates for us. Let's see how we're doing on that. Jeff, you want to go ahead and bring us up, and then let's see how we're doing. Our goal, by the way, on all these episodes is to turn the world green, not just because of Veeam, but just because it makes the map look cooler. So let's see if we kind of zoom in a little bit. We can take a look at, can we start off in maybe the Americas? Or are we not zooming today? Okay, there we go. Okay, so we got Arizona representing. We got Ohio. Y'all refer to the Ohio? I don't know, but maybe that's
We
just
sure
a
do.
formality. But if you're going to be the Ohio state, then certainly the great state of Texas, as we are sovereignly known, is also representing as well. So let's see. So if we kind of go over to the old country, we got I think that's Finland representing on the top of the screen. I have not gotten a chance to go there yet. And Portugal, some very fine beverages have come out of there that I'm a fan of. And speaking of culinary feats, always a fan when Brazil shows up. Those folks know meat, and they know wine. And if you do those two things right, everything else is pretty forgivable along the way. So yeah, so please feel free to keep piling on along the way. Leah, you want to share some more stories?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think we were going to talk a little bit about some experiences you had with things besides natural disasters. One in particular that we talked about was a situation in New York when there was a
Yep.
different kind of geopolitical situation happening.
Yeah. So as I said, I've been doing this a really long time. I did have customers in World Trade Center on 9/11. And this was a financial company. And so every second mattered, because literally every second was thousands and tens of thousands of dollars of IT transactions. So when you're doing that, backup is absolutely insufficient, right? So for them, it was not only replication, it was synchronous replication. Everything had to be running in multiple data centers at once. Now, the original plan, though, was you need the data centers to be separate so that anything that was physical and infrastructure would not damage it. But you need highly skilled people to do that. So you want the people to be able to get to the alternate infrastructure and maintain this as a single set of IT services. So primary data center was in Tower 1. Secondary data center was in Tower 2. And we all know the tragic loss of life that happened in that. The lesson learned, though, that I would offer, though, is they did have a third data center because they said, what if the worst possible thing happened? The third data center was in Hoboken, New Jersey, which is literally a small ferry ride from Manhattan over to Hoboken along the way. In fact, you can see Manhattan skyline from Hoboken. I used to have an office there for a little while. The problem was when a crisis of scale happens, you often see regional disruption as well. There was power disruption, and then you couldn't commute from one side to the other. That entire tri-state area got locked down. Now, since then, the lesson learned is, if you have data centers and redundant data centers in the financial district, your tertiary copy is Boston or Philly or
it has to
Arizona.
be a FEMA zone away at least, right? I know I was working with one of our VCSP partners about a decade ago, and they were hosted in Switch SuperNap, which is one of the only, I believe, tier 4 data centers in the United States that is available for co-location and other kinds of non-single entity purposes. And they talked a lot about the cautionary reasons why you want to consider having a secondary site be in a FEMA zone away difference. Yes, there are latency issues and all sorts of reasons why from a day-to-day perspective that may not be practical, but I think that it would be, a lot more confidence building to fail over to a secondary data center, deal with those latency issues, and maybe have only a week of data loss. That still sounds a lot better than having all 3 of your locations being in the same place geographically and having all the same issues from personnel to internet access to power access for all 3 of those data centers. So there's definitely lots of great partners out there that can help organizations try to navigate the risks and rewards and the cost benefit. It is incredibly expensive to stand up a secondary site, but that's where the cloud can kind of come in handy, and certainly wasn't as prevalent from a technology perspective as it was in the 9/11 days. Said as someone who grew up in the DC metro area, and my house is now surrounded by data centers. So completely different world we live in.
Yeah, and there are some interesting things that you get out of it. By the way, I can't, you mentioned FEMA. I have to say, one of the coolest field trips I took last summer was to the FEMA crisis center outside of Massachusetts, down in Boston. Their crisis management center is in a nuclear grade bunker. Awesome. That is, I mean, it truly hardened. It literally was supposed to be christened by JFK back in that Cold Era war. The Boston dedication, I think, was like 2 days after his planned trip down to Dallas in the 1960s. So JFK never made it to christen that. But their infrastructure and then their plan as they watch weather-based crises come in, and then how they're going to then navigate and serve in order to enable the citizenry. And then from there, business can take care of themselves. But hugely impressive folks over at FEMA and all the work they do from that. Yeah. So a couple clip arts that I pulled here. The Florida example that we saw, your Fort Lauderdale was a much better example. I was actually trying to find the zip code from that 2.83 year map. We already talked about that, but let's talk about some unnatural disasters, and we should just call this one Hurricane Jason or Hurricane J-Buff. So what you're looking at in the upper right-hand corner is some basic clip art. But one of the very first things that I did early on in my career, so I was working for an integrator, and we came into an environment where one of their 2 massive storage arrays powered the entire data center, had gone offline. And my job, I came in, I was all of early 20-somethings, and found out they did not have backups, because what they explained to us was, we don't need backups because we have synchronous replication and snapshots. Right? Now, the fun part about synchronous replication is that no matter what happens on one copy of your data, the other one, literally in real time, is assured to also have that same data. So that means we should never worry about a hard drive failure in a RAID type configuration. 1 or 2 RAID drives, this is not, hard drives, not ever going to be a problem because we have RAID. If that entire array goes down, not a problem because we have synchronous mirroring. But don't worry, if we had to get to a previous version, we have snapshots. And so you could roll back. So we have all of these things, which therefore means we don't need backups. You know what beat all 3 of those types of protections? Hurricane JBuff. So here's what happened. One of the 2 storage arrays came offline, but don't worry, the other array is fully functional. It still has a full copy of the data. We are still living off of that copy of data. And then, oh, by the way, we still have all the snapshots. Snapshots are also replicated. We're going to be just fine. So I come in and I bring in the new secondary array that's going to be there, and I'm getting ready to line up for this. Did you know that if you type the remirror command line on the command line and say remirror 1 versus 0 instead of 0 versus 1, the storage array does exactly what you told it to. And so I remirrored the virgin array over the top of the existing storage array, thereby cleanly wiping out the other copy of the data that was there. And oh, by the way, all the snapshots that were there, and replication kicked back in, and it made sure they were all in sync. And now I have 2 perfectly clean virgin arrays with no surviving storage on either one of them. So Hurricane JBuff. What do you think, Leah?
What can go wrong will go wrong, right? I mean, sometimes it's not about some sort of massive story. Sometimes it is just a what can go wrong will go wrong situation, especially when you have, people touching individual components but maybe don't have the right access rights, or just simply things went wrong. I think we hear those kinds of stories all the time. We certainly hear them from our community. So I know we had the great pleasure in the last couple of weeks of having a lot of our community team members post stories on the Veeam Community Hub. Now, if you're not on the Veeam Community Hub, I really recommend taking a look at community.veeam.com. It is a great opportunity to connect with fellow users, partners in our ecosystem, folks who really use the products on a day-to-day basis, but are also hardcore backup admins, right? These are people who spend their days working in backup land and have probably shared whatever situation that you've been in, or have any kind of question that you have. There's probably somewhere that's done it. So it's a great opportunity to have everybody connect. Now, in the last couple of weeks, we asked our top community members, specifically our vanguards and legends, hey, what is the worst backup story you've ever had? And I think we had some really great ones that are sort of in the vein of what Jason was just describing, where what can go wrong could go wrong. One of the stories that I read about that I loved was talking about a situation where one of our vanguards was helping out with a migration project in their one of their customers' environments. They were really excited. They planned it for months. They were migrating to new server arrays. I think there was a database involved in that migration project. So they had all of that mapped out, ready to go. However,
mapped out and ready to go, you say?
Yes, we thought we had a plan here. We love to have a plan. But there was something wrong that happened. There was a catastrophic issue during the migration process, and they weren't able to find that plan because they didn't back up the networking components. It's always something silly like that, right? And so what ended up happening was they tried to roll back some of those systems, and unfortunately, not everything was sequenced correctly, and they ran into a situation where some of the files were being written with what they thought was new data, but it wasn't. It was old data, and it ended up corrupting a lot of the files and caused 6 hours of downtime because they had to unspool this thread and try to figure out where those component breakdowns were, and ultimately set up those networks again to be able to try to do the migration on another day. But in the meantime, they were just happy to be up and running. So there's lots of stories like that on the Community Hub. I know Jason had a couple he wanted to talk about. I did want to shout out Diego, who is watching us on YouTube right now. He mentioned that the worst disaster he ever had was losing their Active Directory. They tried to recover from an old backup. It didn't go well. 1 week later, working 24/7 to rebuild it from scratch, they were able to finally get everything back up and running. And Jason, I know we all recognize that something like Active Directory is just not something that you can lose. So that I can imagine, Diego, was incredibly challenging. If you had something similar happen with AD or other critical tier 1 workloads that were important to your business, let us know in the comment section of wherever you're tuning in, because certainly that was a very catastrophic issue. But Jason, I know there was a couple of community stories you saw that you wanted to talk about.
Oh yeah, I was going to pile on Diego's thing as well, and by the way, it's worth noting, Leah and I are both former Microsoft alums, and so anything that comes around AD is always going to be close to our hearts as well. So one of the other community stories that was fun, Dips. Don't know if that's a first name, last name, nickname, but we're going with a DJ name. But tells a great story. I pulled a couple excerpts of this, where it turns out, so two things. One, whenever you have domain controllers, you're assuming that the domain controllers are always in sync, right? And so you get some great power out of that, because the rest of the Microsoft infrastructure doesn't really care which domain controller it logs onto. It finds the first one, logs in from there. Turns out the synchronization between the primary DC and the secondary DC had failed. Nobody knows, because they were all just happily logging on to the primary. So everything must be fine. Everything was not fine. A couple things along the way. DCs also can sync files, which is a great place for novice disaster recovery planners to then put your DR plan and infrastructure, because certainly if the DCs are syncing, then you'll have multiple copies and they'll always be available, except they weren't. So primary DC catches on fire. Several other things had gotten on fire too, but the parts of the story I liked best was that the primary DC was on fire. Crispy. So that one's not coming back up. That's when they discovered that the second DC had not been syncing. By the way, because it had not been syncing, not only were the user accounts not there, so they were able to get a lot of their other infrastructure back up, but they couldn't log on to get to any of it because the secondary DC was not healthy. And the only way to recover the other components they couldn't get to were from the backups and the documentation, which were only on the primary DC. So fascinating cascade of errors, and Dips actually did a really nice job of leaning into some bulleted data points. So strongly recommend that story as well. There's a lot of other just administrators sometimes make poor choices. Jeff Burke, one of our vanguards and legends, tells a great story. Two things. One, they thought it would be better to things like antivirus detection software, Leah. Turns out it can slow down machines.
Well, we don't want that production issue, right?
No,
that doesn't seem
necessary
necessary then.
That 1%, 0.5% latency. Now, this story may be old, so maybe it was like 5% latency, but antivirus would just slow things down. So as long as our users are diligent, you're not going to need that on the servers. So they didn't. Oh, fun fact. Backup software on the server can slow you down. So the idea was every workstation in the office had a zip drive attached. And so the backup admin's job was not to manage backup software, because that would be silly. The backup admin's job was to check the health and rotate the zip cartridges on all of the desktops. And that's how they made sure that all of each user's data was clean. By the way, there was actually one lady in Jeff's story. Jeff's story, by the way, is fantastic. You need to read it.
Everybody should see it.
Maybe it becomes a drinking game. There are so many things wrong with Jeff's example. My favorite, though, is the lady in the office that said that the high-pitched whine from all those zip drives was how they were actually programming the minds of the coworkers. It was fabulous. So, yeah, there's a lot of great stories. Please go and check out the Community Hub. Leah, I don't know how, but somehow 29 minutes have passed in this live stream. So we should probably give a shout out. We opted not for the map, but hey, if you're from UK and Romania and a couple other states that I'm not going to mention because they're around Texas and they just want to be. Anyway, there's reasons why I'm biased. But for all those reasons, we want to say thank you for all those that dialed in today. go check out community.veeam.hub. There are some amazing stories out there. I will throw some of mine that I prepared for today that we didn't have a chance to do. But Leah, before the last word, let me give three teases and then you can close this out. Three teases. On Thursday, we have the Veeam 100 show, and we are doing the PowerShell Power Up. If you know PowerShell, you can literally make a server stand on its ear and mow your lawn for you, which I understand you're looking for a lawnmower, Leah. So you should learn PowerShell, and then you'll know. April 9th, this time next week, Leah is going to be back with someone. I think Matt Crape is joining you, right?
Yep.
He is so good. You will not want to miss that episode. We're going to be talking about modernizing and migrating. And Matt is uniquely suited to tell that story. So I will be on the road, but I will be tuning in for that one. And speaking of on the road, you should come and hang out with Leah, me, Matt, and the rest of the gang. We're all going to be hanging out in Fort Lauderdale with our friend Tamika from June 3rd to June 5th at Veeam On. If you know how to spell backup, this is the event that you don't want to miss. Leah, closing words and close us out.
Yeah, my closing words are, we talked a lot about some of these cautionary tales and what can go wrong will go wrong. So I think Jason and I both share the sentiment that it is so important that you execute those day two operations. Don't skimp on testing, setting up those automations, writing down that DR plan, orchestrating your backups. Don't skimp on those things, right? It's not enough to just do a backup, use instant recovery, and call it a day. You absolutely should take the time to do those day two operations. And if you need help doing that, if you need some words of wisdom, check out that community hub because there are lots of people that can come help.
That's right. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next week.